Okay, so let's start with the demonstration for data handling in C++. This was our project for the C++ programming practical exam. So the aim of the experiment is to find the mean, the sum, the standard deviation and the variance of the data entered by the user in a given array. Let's look at the formulas for variance and standard deviation. First of all, for calculating the variance, mean and sum are already easy, so let us assume we have the mean, which is x bar. So each data entry has to be subtracted by the mean, then squared, summed up, and then divided by the number of elements in the array. Standard deviation is the square root of variance. This is the code we'll use for the exercise. Now let us look at the coding window from Dev C++. So the first line initializes a variable called size and its value is 10. In the next line, we declare an array named n, and the size of the array, that is the number of elements which it can hold, is of the value 10. Now, the next line helps us to print a message on the command prompt, and the message would be enter 10 elements in data array, followed by the new line character. This would push the cursor in the next line. For looping statement has been used here so that now we can ask the user to enter the elements in the array. So the first line would print the message enter one data integer and press enter. So this would prompt the user to enter a value in the array which is of the type integer, and as soon as the user presses enter key, another message, the same message would be reprinted, and the loop goes on until 10 times. As we have obtained the elements in the array using the for loop, we have used this block of code that says the array elements are, and the for loop is initiated so that all the elements in the array that have been entered by the user are printed out so that we can see that they have been entered successfully in the program. So the first message here, as you can see in the output window, is enter 10 elements in data array. Then as the user inputs the data one by one, each of the 10 elements have been entered, and as soon as we press the enter key and the for loop is exited, we enter another for loop and the computer successfully prints all the elements in the array entered by the user. Now let's go back to the code. After the array has been printed, now we'll start performing all the operations that are of concern. First of all, we have declared 5 variables here in total, and they are of the type float. The variables are mean, variance, deviation, and here we have initialized the variable sum and sum2 with the value 0. It is a given that if we do not initialize a variable, it will hold some arbitrary value. Now in the for loop, this block of code, this for loop is being used to calculate the sum of all the entries in the data array. So sum equals sum plus an element of array n. Now this ni stands for example, say when the value of I is 0, n0 would stand for the address of the first element in the array. Then subsequently n1 corresponds to the second element in the array, and n9 would represent the 10th element in the array. I++ would increment the value of I within this loop, that is, in the first run of this loop, when I is 0 and the size of I, that is I is less than 10, that is the value of the variable size, I++. The value of I is incremented. After we've calculated the sum using the for loop, the value of the sum will be stored. Now as per the user, these elements sum up to the value 55. So the value 55 would be stored in the variable sum. Now the variable mean is equal to sum divided by size, that is 55 divided by 10. Now 55 divided by 10, 5.5, this value will be stored in the variable mean. Further on, moving to the next loop. This loop is used to calculate the deviation. Deviation stands for by how much the data entry is deviating from the mean. So that can be calculated by subtracting mean from each data entry in the array. Then it is squared using this function power, which has the parameters deviation, 2. So this will keep the value of the power of deviation as 2. So deviation would be squared using this function, and each time a value is squared, it will be added to the variable sum2 as long as this loop runs. So in the end, we'll obtain the value of sum2, which would contain all the variables, that is all the data entries subtracted by the mean and then squared and added. The next step to calculate the variance is divide that by the number of elements in the array, that is 10, which is stored in the variable size. So sum2 divided by size would be as shown in the formula. So the looping statement completed only this much part, and after the looping statement has ended, we have divided this whole part, this summation, by n. Moving on further, the standard deviation would be calculated in this statement using a simple formula, that is square root. Square root is the function present in CMath library, which has been included in the header files, which can be used directly, and so is the power formula also available in the math file. Again, these cout statements have been used to print the sum, message sum, and then the value of the variable sum will be printed. And the same is with mean, variance, and then standard deviation would be calculated on the spot and then printed. Here is the new line character. We have entered the return value to be 0 for the int main function. As soon as the execution has stopped, the system would encounter the return value. If it returns the return value as 0, it means that there was no error. See here, the return value is 0. And in the output, we can see that the sum, mean, variance, and standard deviation has been printed. This was simple. Thank you, everybody.